Ted, I'm here at the Program of Action. Sorry you're not, but good to talk to you just the same. I'm sure you're very disappointed not to be here.
I am. I had a tremendous time at the UN in July watching the Arms Trade Treaty negotiations fail, and I was really hoping to be at the UN watching the Program of Action negotiations fail. But you can't be everywhere.
No, and I'll tell you, they're not failing, but they sure are dragging on. As I like to say, it's UN speak 100%, talking in circle after circle after circle.
Well, if there's one thing the UN is really doing, it's achieving its goals through extremely incremental measures. They'll always take 5% and come back in 5 years for another 5%.
But you wrote a very compelling commentary on why you think the U.S. actually needs to pull out of the UN's Program of Action. Several reasons you looked at, but let's start with the fact that it has been ineffective from the start.
Yeah, and given the fact that it is avowedly pro-gun control, I'm not very unhappy that it's been ineffective. Right. But if you take a look at serious, sensible things that we could actually be doing, some of which the U.S. does do on its own, I don't think there's anyone out there who argues that nations shouldn't be able to control their own borders. That's an inherent part of national sovereignty. If the U.S. really cooperated with allies to help nations that want to improve their own border controls get a little better, I think that's a very sensible thing to do. Unfortunately, what the Program of Action has done at the UN is ignore all the sensible, minor technical things they could be doing and go straight for the red meat, which for them is gun control.
Yep, and you know, Richard Patterson from the industry talked about that last week, and he talked about how not only the Program of Action, but other programs here at the UN have been hijacked by groups like IANSA. It's all about pushing their agenda.
Yeah, I was really surprised, really shocked. Perhaps I shouldn't have been, but I was really shocked when I went to the July Arms Trade Treaty negotiation conference and found out that the person responsible for coordinating NGO presentations avowedly works for IANSA. This is very strange that you've got the United Nations, which is supposed to work for the member states, not be some sort of world government over them, is openly taking a position in favor of extremely contentious things like the Arms Trade Treaty, like the Program of Action, and not playing the sort of impartial role that a lot of Americans think it exists to play.
No, and I mean, gosh, we can remember back in the days of Rebecca Peters when she was with IANSA. She really was the voice of the UN when it came to the Arms Trade Treaty.
Yeah, and what we see, unfortunately, is exactly the same organizations involved in the Program of Action that we saw in the Arms Trade Treaty, although maybe I should put it the other way around, since the Program of Action is older than the Arms Trade Treaty. But what I say to people who argue that the Arms Trade Treaty didn't have any Second Amendment content was, you know, you've been pushing gun control at the UN through the Program of Action for well over a decade, and now you come along with the Arms Trade Treaty and say it's completely innocent. Well, unfortunately, you've burned all your credibility with me and a lot of other Americans a long time down the road. So we're not really going to fall for it this time around.
And look, when you look back at when John Bolton was here, he was talking about the Program of Action, drawing the line in the sand when it came to civilian ownership and the legal manufacturing and trade of firearms. Never happened, and the pro-gun NGOs brought that up last week again, saying you're great speakers, but you're bad listeners. Nothing has been done on that, but the Program of Action is still working.
Yeah, I really wish that we had a John Bolton back again, although unfortunately looking back at Ambassador Bolton's memoirs, I fear he was a little too optimistic. Because if you take a look at what Ambassador Bolton wrote in 2007, he was very sure at that point that the Program of Action had been completely stopped, that the UN had won, that the U.S. had won, that the UN had given up on gun control, and yet 5 years later, we're back at the same old grindstone. So I hate to criticize Ambassador Bolton, but unfortunately, he was just a little too optimistic on this score. These people have enormous endurance.
Oh, they do, and they make that very clear. We got the time, we got the money. But another thing you talk about in your commentary about the reason the U.S. should pull out of the POA is what's called ISACs, the International Small Arms Control Standards. That has got a lot of people here worried again because they're concerned that ISACs is going to be pulled into the POA. And again, they say it's been hijacked. You know, SAMI pulled out of it for that very simple reason, that it's all about pushing the anti-gun agendas of the groups like IANSA and Oxfam.
Yeah, and it's not just SAMI that's pulled out. Other manufacturers have pulled out as well. ISACs has really been a process that's been shrouded in mystery. We only have 8 of the 24 so-called modules released now, 16 more to come, therefore, obviously. And among the 16 are really contentious ones, like, as the Isaac site itself puts it, quote unquote, restricting civilian access to firearms. That one is going to be an unpopular one, to say the least. But even the Isaacs modules that have been released so far are predicated throughout on civilian gun control. So the real risk for me of the program of action is that the UN is often another one of its norm creation efforts. It's trying to write international law without the bother of actually consulting member states or going through any sort of treaty-making process in the United States. This is a useless, broken UN program that achieves nothing that's in the U.S.'s interests and could cause us a lot of problems down the road. So why don't we just leave now?
Yep, and you suggest, too, that the U.S. should propose the elimination of the UN mandate for the POA. What are the odds you think that would happen right now under this administration?
I think the odds of the U.S. proposing the elimination of this mandate are precisely zero right now, and I think the odds of the U.S. winning that argument, should it in fact propose the elimination of the mandate, are, if possible, less than zero. But I still think it's important that Americans who are concerned about Second Amendment liberties keep on pressing this administration and any future administration to get out of this. This is not simply a Second Amendment issue, though of course it is. This is another ineffective, useless UN talking shop. If it did something that was beneficial for the U.S. and the U.S. national interests, then we would support it. It would be worth supporting. But right now, it does nothing. You read the official U.S. statement to the program of action this year, and what was their first recommendation? Guys, you need to hold fewer meetings because you're doing way too much and you're not achieving anything. When the U.S.'s official recommendation is, guys, you're not doing anything and you need to sort of, have a few fewer meetings, I think we can safely say that pretty much everyone has recognized that this is not an institution that is doing a whole lot that's very useful.
No, and even the supporters of the POA admit, they were talking about it today, how they're not happy with the fact that it hasn't been as effective. They won't use the word ineffective, but they say, it hasn't been as effective as we would like. They want to make changes to it, and they keep talking about what they need to do, but they never talk about the achievements because I don't think they really have too many they can really point to.
Well, you go back to 2008, the UN Secretary General said flat out that the program's achievements were not substantive. And if you go through my publication, which came out on Friday, you'll find a lot of other people, pro-gun control, NGOs, UN officials, saying exactly the same thing. This is not an effective program. The only serious achievement that it has to its name is the development of these so-called norms, which are intended to infiltrate into the American judicial process and change the mind of our judges, change the mind of our lawyers, change the mind of any administration, and try to encourage them to find ways to restrict gun access, to impose step-by-step partial gun control in this country in ways that they could never achieve through any sort of open treaty process.
And you said it goes on and on. They're already talking about meetings to 2018. This, when you really look at what goes on here, and I say every American now should have to come here to the United Nations and sit in on one of these conferences to see what they're paying for. But when you look at it, it's really about keeping the UN in business so it can do what it does and keeping IANSA and Oxfam in business. If they didn't have this, what would they have?
Well, you should never forget that New York is a wonderful city. The UN has fantastic headquarters. There are a lot of national representatives and NGO representatives who really like coming to New York, and I certainly agree with them on that. And this is a wonderful way for them to show up every couple of years and spend a very pleasant few weeks in New York, not working particularly hard and enjoying the delights of a great American city. Now, alongside that, of course, they're all pro-gun control. So I'm not really up for paying for their vacation, and I'm not really up for enabling their gun control agenda, and I'm sure as heck not up for enabling more useless, non-functional UN committees. So I think those are three pretty good reasons for the U.S. to give this whole thing a pass.
Yep, and good reasons why gun owners need to take what goes on here very seriously. It is like watching paint dry, as one of my photographers who was shooting one of the conferences said. But it really is something that if they have the chance and if they have the time, it's all about eliminating and eroding our firearm freedoms and our individual freedoms right here in the U.S.
Oh, absolutely. And unfortunately, the ringleaders in this are, of course, the non-Aligned movement led by Iran, the African group, 54 nations, and our friends, the Mexicans, who have taken one of the leading roles in the whole program of action and in the Arms Trade Treaty, whose clear line stated over and over again is that there is no such thing as the international trade in arms. It is all domestic. Therefore, it must all be regulated and really, from their point of view, must all be banned. Now, that's not going to fly in the United States, and we really have nothing to gain from continuing a discussion based on those premises.